I think I even used that exact quote somewhere in this book. In fact, I know I did. And I said, what did I say? Each happy family is alike. I can't remember. Anyway, I don't think any family in any condition is like any other family in any other condition, or for that matter, like that same family in any previous moment. I mean, one of the things that's so incredibly challenging about family life is how the conditions and dynamics are always changing, so that any lesson you learn is learned too late to be applied. You know, with kids, you just figure something out, at which point it's useless, because we're on to the next problem, whose solution will take exactly as long as the problem exists.
I'm asking because it's impossible to read your book without questioning one's own relationship. And I was wondering, was that your intention? And if so, why?
Well, it was in the sense that I wanted to write about something that felt true to me, and when you write, you have to believe that what's true for you is going to be true for some others. Not in any universal sense, but that's the kind of leap of faith that all fiction depends on. And not only that, but in a funny way, like the further you move from the instinct to universalize, like the greater the leap of faith, and I think the better it often works. That the more esoteric you are, the more specific you are, whether it's culturally specific or experientially specific, the greater chance you have of being recognized. Because the more specific you are, the more authentic you're being. I have a good friend in Hamburg who I saw a couple nights ago, and he was telling me that he had 2 copies of the book, so a very good friend. And he and his wife were reading it in bed next to each other that night, and he said he got to one passage about the way that this couple was interacting and the way that their sexual life had kind of dissolved. And he said, I read it, and I just wanted to throw the book across the room because it just felt a little too familiar. And he said, the second I had that instinct, my wife threw the book across the room. So, you know, the truth is, we have no idea what other people experience. I have no idea what, you know, somebody in Zurich experiences, and I have no idea, at the end of the day, what my own children experience. We just make assumptions and leaps of faith that often depend on believing that fundamentally, whatever the conditions of our lives and circumstances of our lives, fundamentally we share things. And maybe those things were, as I was saying about the ocean or the baby walking off the cliff, those are things that are spun into us and are deeper than the circumstances of our lives. The first radio interview I ever gave was in Philadelphia, and it was a call-in show where people phone in and they ask questions. And the first caller said, this is for Everything is Illuminated, and he said, I want to thank you for writing my family story. We found it very difficult to share some of these, some of our history, and you gave us a language to do so. And so I'm imagining like me on the other end of them. And he said, being a 60-year-old black man in Trenton, and I thought, what? Did I mishear him? I looked at the radio interviewer and we kind of like winked without actually moving any of our faces. And afterwards I felt so ashamed of my response because it was predicated on the idea that we couldn't have the same story because we had different colors of skin, or we had different ages, or we lived in different cities. And literature should be the antidote to that assumption, and instead assume that we have the same story and we're separated by conditions and circumstances. And it's an idea that has a huge amount of importance right at this exact moment in history, when the rise of what, for maybe lack of a better word, you'd call nationalism in America and in Europe, depends on this notion that our stories are as different as the circumstances of our lives are different. And so we protect people whose circumstances are the same, and we try to tell the same story by singing the same anthems and waving the same flag and maybe reverting to the same currency, rather than, you know, extending ourselves.
Now that you bring it up, I wanted to talk about this later, but no matter, we have to, you being American at this time, we have to talk about it. How do you feel about your new president? And do you feel the urge to do something with your skills?
Well, I regret to tell you that we're all American at this time, and if you think you're not, you're going to get a rude awakening very soon. So this is definitely a global problem, and it's not unique to America. It's, you know, in a way representative of something that's been going on around the globe. In a certain sense, it's more worrisome because America, you know, occupies a bigger slice of the pie than a lot of countries in terms of production and consumption and its ability to dictate rules and cultural norms. In certain ways, I think it's maybe less of a problem because I don't think America is moving to the right. I think America is actually moving to the left. You know, 3 million more people voted for Hillary, and that was despite the fact that the election was tampered with, and despite the fact that even if he is an asshole and she's a brilliant person, he is a better candidate in the sense of, for whatever reasons, persuading people to follow you. You know, being a good candidate does not mean being a good person. Historically, right around where we are, we've witnessed some extremely charismatic, extremely evil people who have the power to convince people to follow them. So if the conditions had been different, if they had been different candidates, if it hadn't been tampered with, and if we had a different electoral system, I think a different America would have been revealed, and people right now would be saying, phew, thank God America isn't following the rest of the world toward this kind of nationalism. That having been said, he is the president, and there's going to be an awful lot to resist. And like many people I know, I'm now questioning what are my abilities to resist. And you know, there can be a kind of narcissistic resistance, and there can be a useful resistance. I went to the march in New York, like every single person I know. It was as if every building just emptied and people came down to the street. And there was a lot of people like taking selfies of themselves, you know, giving the middle finger to who? I don't even know. And it accomplishes something to show up in numbers, but there's also a kind of, I think, humility that will be required in terms of changing one's own life. So one example is the environment, okay? I know many, many, many liberals who are pulling their hair out about the possibility that Trump will, you know, rip up the Paris Accords, the Kyoto, will change our greenhouse gas emission standards. The reality is there's nothing that Trump can do that will have nearly the same effect on the environment as our eating habits do. But it's harder to look at our own eating habits, to say, if I were to refrain from eating certain products, like factory-farmed products, which we know are the #1 cause of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, #1 cause of deforestation, loss of biodiversity, then the change would be inside of us. But it's not as fun as making a funny poster and sticking up your middle finger at a camera.
So you're saying that we're too fixated on hating Trump instead of changing ourselves?
I think it has to be both. And because, you know, there's no change I can make in my own life that's going to allow more Syrian refugees into America. That's so, you know, there are different